Video games and violence. For years, violent crimes committed in the real world have been thought to be related to the levels of violence in popular video game franchises such as Call of Duty, Halo, Grand Theft Auto, Battlefield, and countless other games. Personally, as a gamer, I don't believe that there is any connection between the violence in video games and the crimes committed by players in the real world. After the Columbine shooting on April 20th, 1999, where two gunmen killed 12 students and one teacher, the media immediately blamed violent video games for motivating the two students to commit these violent acts. Ever since then, any time a violent crime is committed by anyone, video games are automatically the first thing to be blamed for these incidents. Here are some statistics on video games and crime by Michael Ward.
So let's take a look at this link between these recent teen killers and video games.
Violent video games increase aggressive behavior as much as lead exposure decreases children's IQ scores.
Where is the artistic value of shooting innocent victims?
They put guns in the hands of little kids and teach them how to kill.
He was trained to kill with Call of Duty and other video games.
Is it true that violent video games make people more violent? I'm a professor of economics at the University of Texas at Arlington and a casual gamer. I'm also a parent of children who enjoy video games, and I was curious to find out if video games could cause them to harm others. So I did some research. I conducted 3 studies to investigate the link between real-world video game usage and actual crime or fighting. These studies used different methodologies and different data sources, and in all 3 cases, I found that more video game playing is actually associated with less real-life violence. That's right, less. A 100% increase in violent video game consumption led to a 1% statistically measurable decrease in violent crime. Okay, that's not a big decrease, but it undermines the claim that violent video games increase violence. So how could virtual violence decrease actual violence? One theory is catharsis, which is to say letting off steam. One might vent violent impulses through a video game rather than upon an actual person. Another theory has to do with time management. Even without a cathartic effect, every hour that people are sitting at home playing video games is an hour that they're not out on the streets getting into trouble. I'm not alone in my findings. Recently, other researchers have published findings that cast further doubt on the link between violent video games and actual violence. But all this means that, however well-intentioned the calls for restrictions on violent video games are, as a society, we would be censoring games based on a mistaken belief that they cause violence, and could actually be leaving Americans exposed to more real-life harm. And calls for such censorship continue, as in Congress's recently proposed Video Games Ratings Enforcement Act, and the 2011 Supreme Court case Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association. And there's even more at stake if we were to allow this censorship. Video games have changed a lot in the past 30 years. What were once simple black and white blocks and nearly indiscernible images flickering on a television screen are now lifelike beings whose actions we experience on a visceral level. Some games now tell stories and evoke emotional responses similar to the finest literature, film, or theater. And video games are perhaps the fastest developing form of artistic expression ever devised. The artistry and techniques used by game creators continues to expand and evolve rapidly. Restrictive legislation would curb the freedom of artists and possibly stop valuable stories and content from ever being shared. Contrary to popular belief, youth violence has steadily declined over the past 20 years, exactly when video games have become popular. This is hardly consistent with the idea of games causing violence. When people are violent, it's not because games made them that way.
Most people that are against violent video games argue that there is a direct link between the levels of violence in video games and the crimes that are committed by the players of these games. They claim that there are studies to show a link between the two. But all of these studies are flawed because the aggression isn't in a real-world situation, but instead is antagonized by the researchers. Today in America, 91% of all teens play violent video games. In 2015, video game sales were at an all-time high, while teen violence was at an all-time low. A long-term study has shown the violence in video games, film, and TV has increased dramatically over the past 30 years, but at the same time, youth violence has decreased dramatically in the past 30 years. Now, I'm not saying that video games are responsible for the decrease in violence, but it certainly doesn't cause players to commit violent crimes. There are two possible reasons that this occurs. One is that players are playing so much that they are too occupied to go out into the real world and commit violent crimes. And two is that violent video games let players release their aggression in a healthier way than going out into the real world and releasing these frustrations. Video games are not the problem. People need to stop blaming video games for violence and focus on the real-world causes, such as mental illness, bad home life, society, and other factors that are connected to violent crimes. Mental illness and a bad home life are big contributors to violent crimes committed by kids and teens. Society also plays a big part because America as a whole glorifies killers, and if someone is feeling depressed, they might feel that if they do something very violent and dangerous, that they can go down in infamy. Think about it. Can you name anyone that was killed in the Sandy Hook or Columbine shootings? Can you name one of the victims in 9/11? Can you tell me anyone that was killed in the Dark Knight Rises shooting? Most people can't answer any of these questions, but I bet we can tell you who did each one of those things. Video games aren't the problem. Society is.